When Ava met Leo, he was crouched beneath a flickering streetlight outside St. Martin's psychiatric clinic, chain smoking in the cold. She had just been discharged again. Schizoaffective disorder, they said. Ava preferred to call it living in two realities and belonging in neither. Leo was there visiting his younger sister. His own diagnosis, PTSD with dissociative episodes, was something he rarely spoke of. He didn't like labels, just like Ava didn't like being pitied. That night, she borrowed a cigarette from him, even though she didn't smoke. He offered it without asking her name. She lit it, took one puff, coughed, and said, "Do you ever feel like the world is just too bright to look at?" Leo blinked twice, nodded once, and didn't speak for 2 minutes. It was the beginning of everything. They started meeting on the hospital lawn every Thursday afternoon. When the air turned gray and the city slowed down, she would bring drawings, sharp, erratic, pulsing with color. He would bring a flask of lukewarm coffee and a silence that made her feel less insane. Ava said her voices weren't always cruel, just persistent. Leo said he sometimes dissociated during arguments and woke up with blood on his knuckles and no memory of why. They weren't gentle, but they were honest. By December, they had moved into a crumbling studio above a record store. It was too cold, too small, and the walls were thin enough that they could hear each other breathe. She painted during her lucid spells. He read poetry out loud when the nights got too long. One night, Ava stayed awake for 3 straight days. The voices returned, louder, sharper, like broken glass in her brain. Leo tried to help. She lashed out, said he was just a shadow pretending to care. He left, quietly, like always. She didn't notice the door was still unlocked. He returned hours later with hospital forms and a shaking voice. "Please come back with me just until you're steady." She refused. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the floor beside her in silence. They both stared at the paint, peeling from the ceiling like it held answers. At some point, she rested her head on his shoulder. "It hurts," she whispered. "It hurts so much to exist." He wrapped his arms around her. "I know," he said, "but we don't have to do it alone." 3 days later, she checked herself involuntarily. Leo visited every day, brought her new sketchbooks, wrote letters on napkins, whispered poems through the visiting room glass. She started sketching again, this time less chaos, more shape. The voices didn't vanish, but they softened. When she came home, the studio was clean, warmer. He'd painted her favorite quote on the wall. "We're not broken, just rearranged." Ava smiled, not because she was healed, but because she was trying, because Leo was still there, and because, for the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger to herself. Rain felt like it had something to say. The city was soaked in gray, and so was Camille. She stood outside the public library in a wool coat that clung to her frame, counting her breaths in sets of 4. OCD had turned her routines into rituals, and stepping on the wrong crack in the sidewalk could ruin an entire day. She didn't expect anyone to understand. Then came Mason. He was arguing with a payphone, calling it a traitor. His schizoaffective disorder made the world slippery and strange. But he greeted her with the gentlest smile she'd ever seen, like she wasn't something to brace for. They met again the next day and the day after that, always at the library. Camille would sit with a crossword puzzle. Mason would draw spirals in a tattered sketchbook and hum jazz under his breath. Neither of them asked questions. They just showed up. One afternoon, he offered her a folded piece of paper. Inside was a sketch of a woman with bandaged wrists and wings made of feathers and pills. She survives, he said, even when she doesn't want to. Camille didn't speak, just reached out and touched his hand like it was fragile glass, and that was the beginning of something messy, brave, and terrifying. For weeks they were stitched together by silence and small rituals, Friday movie nights, Sunday coffee at 5:17 p.m., always at the same booth. Camille began to loosen her routines. Mason started to trust his voice more than the ones in his head. But healing isn't a straight line. The first rupture came in December. Mason missed 3 days of meds and showed up at her door barefoot, shaking, convinced the city was whispering about him. Camille panicked, her fear of unpredictability colliding with his unraveling mind. She told him to leave. He did. The next morning, the silence was unbearable. Camille scrubbed her apartment twice, reorganized every book alphabetically, cried without knowing why. She hated herself for pushing him away. But more than that, she hated how broken they both were. 2 days later, she found him at the pier, soaked, cold, but smiling. "You didn't run," he said. "I did," she replied. "But I came back." They stood there, soaked in rain and regret, holding hands like life rafts. Camille began therapy again. Mason started painting professionally. Even when his hands trembled, they didn't promise to fix each other, they promised to try. And on New Year's Eve, when the sky exploded in color over the sound, Camille whispered, "Even when I spiral, I want to spiral towards you." Mason kissed her cheek and said, "Then let's fall together gently." And they did.
The first time Cal saw Iris, she was screaming at the Charles River like it had personally betrayed her. Her jacket was inside out, her mascara bleeding, and her voice shook with the kind of rage you only earn by being ignored for too long. Cal didn't mean to stare. He just saw something familiar. Not in the anger, but in the way she screamed without apology. He had been silent for so long, living in the shell of his own mind. Diagnosed with major depressive disorder at 16, Cal moved through the world like a ghost with polite manners. He wrote poetry no one read, kept his apartment quiet and cold, and avoided mirrors. Iris was noise and fire and windstorms. She had bipolar eye and described mania like her brain was on fire, and sadness like a drowning with no water. She was not subtle. She told Cal that the second time they met, sitting in a laundromat at 2 a.m., "You look like someone who's forgotten what music sounds like," she said. "I could scream it back into you." Cal didn't know how to reply, so he just said thank you. They were a strange rhythm. She talked too fast and he listened too slow, but they began meeting at that laundromat every Sunday night, sharing stories and silence, depending on the weather in their minds. He started to look forward to her chaos. She started to trust his quiet. October brought cold fronts and memory triggers. Cal's medication stopped working. He stopped writing. Iris noticed when he stopped smiling, even slightly. One night he didn't show up. She waited until 3 a.m., then walked to his apartment. He didn't answer the door. She climbed the fire escape and found him on the floor, eyes open but vacant. "You don't get to leave," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "Not without a fight, not without me." She stayed with him until morning, didn't sleep, didn't blink, just kept saying, "You're not alone. Not anymore." The next week, they both checked into the same outpatient program. Cal started writing again, short pieces, mostly about water. Iris painted every hallway in her apartment in different colors because her therapist told her movement wasn't always physical. On Thanksgiving, they shared a frozen pizza and held hands under a blanket. "I'm scared I'll burn you down," she said softly. He kissed her forehead. "Then I'll be the ocean. Just don't run." They still had bad days, days when she forgot where she was, days when he disappeared into silence, but they always found their way back to that laundromat on Sundays, not for the washing machines, but for each other. They were broken, yes, but they were loud, alive, and never alone again.